So, good evening and welcome to this Cantor Technology lecture for 2024. Great to see you all here in person and all those online as well. I'm Rob James. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Life Sciences, and it's my pleasure to say a few words about Carl before we start. So, Carl studied archaeological sciences at Bradford, graduating in 1984. He then completed a PhD at University College Cardiff and spent 2 years at the University of Liverpool as a postdoctoral researcher before taking up a lecture at, and you guessed it, Bradford. Where else? Once back in Bradford, he was key to the development and success of the department, moving over the next 26 years through lecturer to professor by way of many roles, including head of department and dean of School of Archaeology, Geography and Environmental Sciences. And that's my colleagues trying to remember the right names as we've gone through the eons. So Carl then moved to become Director of Scientific Research at the British Museum in 2016, a role in which he leads a team of scientists who undertake research on all aspects of the British Museum's collections. Between September 2023 and June 2024, Carl was Acting Deputy Director at the British Museum. So Carl's research interests span molecular and isotopic approaches applied to archaeological materials, and the overarching focus is on how science can help us understand past people and their technologies, which is why his work fits so well in the theme of this lecture series. Staff at Bradford, many remember Carl as a fantastic colleague and leader, inspirational to work with, both academically, but also in the way he treated everyone he worked with. Since leaving Bradford, Carl has remained a good friend of the university with joint research and publications. His behind-the-scenes tours at the British Museum have been a highlight for many students over recent years. However, we still suspect Carl's heart is in Yorkshire, as amongst other things, his love of felt running brings him back here whenever he can. And on that note, I'd like to pass over to Carl.
Gosh, thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? I do tend to speak quite loudly in presentations. So thank you very much, Rob, for that introduction. That was wonderful. I'll have a copy of that, please, for future reference. So I've been here this afternoon. I've had a chat with students and seen some of the amazing facilities that you have been successful in your funding. The infrastructure here is magnificent and wonderful. It's so gratifying to see how well archaeology has continued, archaeological sciences, and diversified in the time that I've been away from the university. So thank you, congratulations to you all. Thanks to Brian for supporting the Cantor Technology lecture. I'm very pleased and honoured to present to you this evening. I must thank Anna for putting all the arrangements in place and for being patient with me when I was supposed to send slides in advance. I didn't. It was good. I actually still live in Bradford. I just live up the road from here. So I came up from London last night. So more about that in a moment. So yes, having seen so much this afternoon about what's wonderful about Bradford, it all started here in terms of archaeological sciences. It's a grainy image, but it's of the then head of archaeological sciences, Arnold Aspinall, who was head of department when I joined the department in 1980. And he's doing here what he did best, teaching, instructing students. He was a great teacher. We all learned huge amounts from him. We're all inspired by him. He was a physicist by training, but really applied himself creatively and in an innovative way to archaeology. And he did community archaeology before the term was even used in the discipline. A great scholar and leader. So we owe a lot to him. And then I came along. This is me when I returned to Bradford in the 1990s. I toned down the shirt colour, if not the patterns. But and this is me in one of the laboratories just in the Horton building, just over the road in Horton A, the top floor. And I'm masquerading as if I know what I'm doing with the liquid chromatograph. It was really a photograph just for publicity purposes only. I had absolutely no idea. Worse, there's no students in sight. There should be, but it was probably my research laboratory, and I was probably worrying about my next journal article or my next research grant application. But no, 26 years teaching in Bradford, and it's been a huge honour and pleasure to do that. So, yes, so cultural heritage. I've set myself a bit of a task to try and talk about the past, present, and future. So it really will skim along the surface of a huge diversity and range of questions and issues. There is meant to be time for discussion at the end, and Rob's going to put his hand up at 40 minutes and say that I've got 5 minutes left. So I do hope I finish and that there's time for questions and discussion. But this is Peter, Bradford PhD graduate, who spent some time in the museum a few years ago in London. This is the British Museum doing light sensitivity tests on the Great Wave, one of 3 impressions of the Great Wave held in the British Museum collection. And Bradford graduates have actually done a sterling and fantastic job in cultural heritage, working in the museum sector. Siobhan Watts is head of conservation at Liverpool Museums. Rebecca Stacey, who did 2 degrees at the University of Bradford, is a member of the team at the British Museum. Imran Ahmed, who did an MSc Forensic Archaeology some years ago, is a collection manager in the Middle East department of the British Museum. So there's a real distinguished record of colleagues that have gone on and done wonderful things from the platform that Bradford has given them. The British Museum itself has a collection spanning 2 million years of human history. It's a remarkable collection, around 8 million objects. It depends on how you count them. And I'm going to say a little bit about the museum and its history, and a little bit about those interactions with science. How did science come on board? What was science trying to achieve, and where are we now? So I called it Faraday, who engaged a lot with the museum in the 1830s to the 1850s, and then up to AI. As if I know anything about AI. There are people in the audience that know a lot more about AI than I do, but obviously it's something that in the cultural heritage sector, we need to be aware of it, its implications, its potential, and perhaps some of the issues that it raises for us all. So that's where I'll end, and hopefully invite discussion at that point. So my role at the British Museum is to try and integrate scientific research into the work of the museum, to align with museum priorities. We have a museum research strategy. We work with external partners, universities, and so on. And we have PhD students. We have collaborative PhD student program. So my talk, I'm going to say a little bit about introduction context, the foundation of the museum. A temporary experiment was when the laboratory was established here. A case study around how scientific research works and feeds into the exhibitions process, the AI landscape for cultural heritage, and then future direction. So let's go on to the introduction and context. So Mark Walport is a trustee of the British Museum. The museum is run by a board of trustees, and Mark was director of the Wellcome Trust, the government's chief scientific officer. So he's held some of the sort of leading positions in UK science. And he wrote a piece for the Times Higher just a couple of months ago. And he argued that museums are a vital part of the national research infrastructure. And now is the time to make the most of it through the application of new tools and technologies. And he drew attention to a pioneering study, as he called it, led by scientists at the British Museum in collaboration with researchers at the STFC, the Science and Technologies Facilities Council. And this work, published last year by my colleague Dan, was on these copper alloy boxes. Now, this is just 5.5 centimeters, so these are tiny. They're topped with animals, in this case, a lizard, if you can just about see that. Now, we use X-rays a lot in the museum, and I'll say a little bit about the history of X-ray imaging in the museum in a moment, but X-rays could not penetrate, even high-energy X-ray systems couldn't penetrate these metal boxes. And there's an idea that they were used as animal coffins, that they had mummified animals, mostly reptiles, molded into the top of these boxes. And so we went to the facility. We had to take the objects away from the museum in order to do that. It's quite a challenge, quite a logistical issue. But we used a new technique, well, for us, for cultural heritage anyway, of neutron tomography that works in a similar fashion to X-ray CT, but relies on neutrons and the attenuation of neutrons as they interact with inorganic, which they tend to pass through readily, but then are able to interact with organic material. So particularly of interest, and you can't really see it terribly well on the screen, but there are bones here which we were able to measure very accurately, and fragments of textiles. So we were able to confirm, we wouldn't open these boxes, of course, in the museum today. They have been done a little bit in the past. We're able to confirm the presence of mummified reptiles within these particular boxes. So Mark was inviting us all to think about how the museum can operate in that kind of context in the future. And his quote here is that success should not be measured simply by the number of publications or research grant income. Rather, it is measured by how well museums enable collections to inspire, change, and touch other people's lives. He didn't go into a huge amount of detail about how that is measured, but I think it's a laudable aim. And I think what I've enjoyed most about the British Museum is the degree to which the research is linked to engagement activity, whether that's national or international. And I wanted to try and give an example as to a very iconic object in the museum. And there are very few of these extant in the world today, known as a chief mourner's costume from Tahiti. It was collected in the 18th century on Cook's second voyage into the South Pacific. And he exchanged them for red feathers from certain birds that he exchanged with the Tahitian islanders that were not available on Tahiti. And he brought back about half a dozen of these chief mourners costumes that were worn when a high-ranking individual died. So it's part of the funerary and mortuary commemoration of a high-ranking individual within Tahitian society. Many have been lost or damaged or dissipated, but this is one of the most intact examples. And I wanted to just show how the research feeds into the wider engagement activities. I should say that the object itself is made up of a dazzling array of organic materials. So you have bark cloth here, which is beaten bark cloth into clothing from the paper mulberry tree or other related species. You've got a bird feather cloak. You've obviously got bird feathers in the headdress. You've got oyster shell here. You've got wooden gorget's crescent shade. And this is all stitched together. So this is worn and stitched together. It's about 8 foot tall as well. So it's a significant costume that was used in these particular contexts. So first of all, research. We wanted to go back and study the collecting history of this particular object in the museum, but we also wanted to study the materials identification. We wanted to look at the dyes, the colorants that were used in the bark cloth. You really won't be able to see. Many of the dyes have actually faded here, but the dyes were coloring the bark cloth, so it's decorated as well. And we wanted to see how the bird feather cloak was connected to the bark cloth costume. So there was a lot of work that we did using scanning electron microscopy and liquid chromatography mass spectrometry to identify the molecular constituents. So the research was undertaken and it was published. That fed into the conservation program. So this mourner's costume had not been displayed in the museum since 1980. So it was in storage from 1980 until it was displayed in an exhibition in 2019, an exhibition that was called Reimagining Captain Cook. It was an opportunity to look back on the implications of Cook's contact with different peoples as he traveled through the South Pacific. But the conservation program was 6 months of intensive work in order to restore the object and to bring that object back to a state in which it could be displayed. And so display, and you see the object here in the gallery for the Reimagining Cook exhibition, and it was a really good free exhibition in the museum. That led into engagement. So we wanted to think about a range of engagement opportunities. So we have Tiano here, the former director of the museum in Tahiti, who came over to the UK to look at the object, to study the object, and we recorded her for a YouTube film. So released as part of the exhibition, the film was able to show her take on the mourner's costume in the context of the museum. We secured funding, and this is Chris Mussell, one of our scientists, to go to Tahiti. We were so interested in the dyestuffs that we wanted to work with communities on Tahiti to look at the types of plants that were being used to procure the dyes. We could get good molecular signals of the dyes from the molecular analysis. What we couldn't get was necessarily the reference materials. We didn't have those in London. So a field trip, it was good, nice for Chris. There was one curator, one conservator, and one scientist went to Tahiti. So we're grateful for the funding that enabled us to do that. And then those reference samples came back. And ultimately, the work with the communities on Tahiti, with the museum and the community groups, led to a request to loan the mourner's costume back to Tahiti. And in 2023, the costume returned to Tahiti for the first time since 1774 to be displayed on long-term loan in the museum there. So initially a 3-year display period. So it's a really nice link. And what then happens is that the engagement activities and the loan, which has created so much interest in Tahiti, actually feeds back into our research. So we've got all sorts of new ideas that we were unaware of the types of bird feather that we use. There's one extinct bird feather, which is incorporated, one extinct bird whose feathers are incorporated into the headdress. So it stimulated a lot of new research into what we could find out. And ultimately, we can then share that back with the communities on Tahiti. So that's the kind of work in which we can do in terms. And Brian Cantor asked me earlier on, what fires me up about the British Museum? It's about doing the research and placing it into that wider context. So it's not just about doing the research for its own sake because of the materials within the museum themselves, but the opportunities that that affords in terms of delivering something, I hope, meaningful for the visitors to the museum, but also people in other places where these objects have derived from. Now, it's an interesting time. There are some highly contentious, deeply felt debates around cultural heritage and the role of museums in the world today. And the British Museum is one of an institution with its history entangled with empire, imperialism, and colonialism. I just selected here 4 recent book covers that highlights some of the debates and some of the contentious issues in the world in which we live. And they all don't take the same vein. So it's often highly polarized situations. So, for example, the Brutish, not the British Museums, but the British Museums, book written by Dan Hicks, published back in 2020, Loot by Barnaby Phillips, both about the Benin bronzes, both fascinating in their own way in terms of the research trajectories that they took. Plunder by Justin Jacobs has just come out, takes an entirely different view. It's actually highly critical of Dan Hicks's approach to the Benin bronzes and charts alternative histories and routes for objects and their ways into Western museums. I would argue that Maria Bolshaw, who's director of the Tate Museums, has written a fantastic book about why museums matter, why museums are relevant to the contemporary context. Museums have to change. They change in alignment with the contemporary world and the direction of the world. And the British Museum must be included in that. And yesterday I was at an opening in London, in Bloomsbury, for a new exhibition, which is kind of co-curated, if you like, between a curator at the museum, a curator for contemporary prints and drawings, Isabel Seligman, and a contemporary artist, Hugh Locke. And Hugh has an incredible background. He's displayed and exhibited his work in many museums around the world. And we worked with him. This is a screenshot from the Guardian last Sunday. It's quite a thing to do a show here, that's at the British Museum, and openly use the word looting. Artist Hugh Locke on decolonising the British Museum. A few years ago, the British Museum would not have gone down this kind of route. This is, I think, the response of the museum to changing circumstances, to thinking through the collections that it holds and wanting them to be discussed more openly, being more honest about the origins, the collecting history of some of the objects in the British Museum. So this exhibition opens to the public tomorrow. And according to Hugh in his speech last night, he wants it to invoke more questions than provide answers. He wants to stimulate debate around collections in museums. And I think, as I say, I think that is to be welcomed, however uncomfortable it might be for some people. The museum, British Museum, has partnerships throughout the UK and further afield. I'm told that the museum loans around 4,000 objects a year around the world, and that more people see objects from the British Museum collection away from Bloomsbury, the main site of the museum, and actually see it on the site. So I don't have the figures to back that up, but here the white dots show the engagement activities and partnership activities across the UK. Some of them are from a few years ago, but they might be loans, they might be co-curated galleries, they might be exhibitions and so on. And I have to say, I'm delighted as an honorary Bradfordian that Bradford Museums, working with the British Museum, and this is part of the City of Culture 2025, some objects, Ice Age art now, will be at Cliff Castle Museum next year from June. And I just want to thank everybody who's involved in that, curators at the British Museum, but also colleagues here for making that happen. I think that will be very special, a sort of ancient and contemporary view of Ice Age art. So I think there's lots of exciting opportunities. So the foundation of the British Museum, I'm going to go right back to basics for a moment. The collection was amassed by an individual called Hans Sloane, and on his death in 1753, the collection was bequeathed to the nation. Sloane was a physician. He studied medicine, and he was physician to the families of 3 British monarchs. He travelled to Jamaica in 1687, where he collected objects, plants, animal specimens, antiquities, and so on, recording and documenting his findings in detail. He married Elizabeth Langley Rose whilst in Jamaica, whose family owned sugar plantations on the island. And much of Sloane's collecting during his life was acquired from the profits of these plantations and the forced labour of enslaved people. Enslaved people, mostly women, actively contributed to Sloane's collecting, particularly his botanical research, helping to collect over 800 items of flora and fauna. And as a young doctor, he treated enslaved people, not always compassionately. Delbourgo, in his brilliant book Collecting the World, The Life and Curiosity of Hans Sloane, said that Sloane was not simply a collector himself, but he collected the collections of others. And around 70,000 objects at the time of his death were part of his collection, everything from books and manuscripts to fossils, to plants, to archaeological objects. And Sloane's will enshrined his commitment to universal free public access, supporting the improvement, knowledge, and information of all persons. And when the museum opened in 1759 on the site of the current museum today, but in a former building, it was the first free national public museum in the world. In practice, access was a little bit more difficult. People had to write in and apply for access to the British Museum to look at the collection, and then they would be escorted around the museum by museum staff. So the kind of experience we have today of long queues and so on didn't really exist then. I think there were no more than a few hundred visitors in the first few years of the British Museum's existence. That obviously grew over time. The first so-called principal librarian of the British Museum was appointed in 1756. The museum opened to the public in 1759. And the museum from the start was overseen by a board of trustees. As I said, that remains the case today. The board is independent of government, but is bound by various pieces of legislation, notably the BM Act of 1963. Knight, Gowen Knight, was the first principal librarian, not born in Leeds, but schooled in Leeds. He was taught at Leeds. He was a pupil at Leeds Grammar School. A physician himself and inventor, he was a specialist in magnetization. He developed a more highly magnetized steel needle for compasses, which were used in maritime transport for many years subsequently. Rolling it on a little bit, throughout the early phase of the life of the museum, its connection to the learned societies meant that eminent scientists were often consulted on the collection. And Faraday, Michael Faraday, the great pioneer of electricity, magnetism, and chemistry, there is extensive correspondence with museum staff, with Faraday advising on chemical treatments. This is in the 1830s to 1850s, taking plaster casts of objects, the deterioration of stone, and so on. There is incredible publication record. All of this correspondence has been published. And this correspondence between Faraday and Edward Hawkins, the keeper of antiquities, is about the Lewis chess pieces on the top right-hand side. And Faraday writes, "My dear sir, I send you a bottle of solution in which to immerse some of the chessmen for an experiment. I ought rather to have sent it to the gentleman I found with you, but have not had the pleasure of his acquaintance or knowledge of his name." It's a bit vague in terms of whether it's a conservation treatment, whether it's cleaning the surface of the Lewis chess. Now, the Lewis chess pieces are a remarkable collection. If you've seen them at the British Museum, I kind of included this because they're among my sort of real favourite objects in the museum collection. So they are made largely from walrus ivory. They date from the sort of second half of the 12th century. And there's 89 chess pieces. There's enough chess pieces for, I think, 4 chess sets, and there's drafts and belt buckles associated. They were recovered in the 1830s, so this is soon after they arrived in the museum. The context for this is that we've just launched a new research project on the Lewis chess pieces. And we're trying to understand the material technology. Very little scientific investigation has ever been undertaken. And we're looking at DNA. We hope it preserves in the pieces because we want to look at the kind of context, the environmental context of walrus. And there are 1 or 2 sperm whale teeth as well in the collection in the North Atlantic region, really to put these objects, which have largely been the subject of scholarly attention through the iconography on the pieces rather than using scientific investigation. So we're moving into a different phase in terms of their life. Again, to think about how we might redisplay these pieces in the gallery. And we really need to know about all the past conservation treatments and what solutions they have been immersed in. If we're going to do DNA, if we're going to do CT scanning, we need to have a really good knowledge. There's very little record in the museum. I'm still searching, but trying to find out what that solution is. I mean, Faraday also cleaned the so-called Elgin Parthenon marbles as well and advised on their cleaning. And we actually have a list of the kinds of treatments that he suggested for that. So yes, we can make some guesses as to what he was doing. Okay, moving on. The penetrative power of X-rays was first realized by William Röntgen in Germany in 1895. Within a year, the first X-rays had been taken of an Egyptian mummy in a museum in Germany, in Frankfurt. And within 4 years of Röntgen's discovery, X-rays were being taken at the British Museum. The trickle down, we might think about today with the launch of new technologies and the rapid way in which those technologies dissipate through our lives and our worlds. Even at the end of the 19th century with X-rays, they were being taken as museum objects within 2-3 years of Röntgen's discovery. And this is the first X-ray that I've been able to find in the British Museum. 1899 it was taken. It's actually in a book on zoology, the Zoology of Egypt, that was written by John Anderson. And there's a footnote which says the radiographs were made at the British Museum by J.H. Gardiner, FCS, I think is probably Fellow of the College of Surgeons, in my presence, 24th of June, 1899. We don't have much of evidence of what kind of device came into the museum. There was certainly no installation of a piece of X-ray equipment into the museum itself. This was portable equipment that was brought in. But we do have equipment that Ernest Harnack used. He was identified as the first radiographer working in a London hospital. He was based in Whitechapel in London, and he used portable X-ray. The health and safety was not really in place, I have to say, and the devastating consequences of X-rays was felt by many people, including Harnack himself, who suffered and had amputations as a result of testing and using X-rays extensively. The object which was X-rayed is shown here on the right. In its wrappings, never been unwrapped, was excavated just a few years before it came into the museum. And it's a mummified baboon, a Hamadryas baboon, identified through its X-rays, dating to the Ptolemaic period. And we have also launched a new project funded by Augmentum, a charitable trust, on the mummies, the animal mummies, I should say. We've done quite a lot of work on the human individuals, but the animal mummies in the collection. There are several hundred in the collection that range from snakes, crocodiles, baboons, cats, dogs, and so on. And again, we're looking at using X-ray and CT scanning in order to try and resolve the animals. The shape of the bundle often says nothing about what's inside, as we're finding from the work that we're doing. And again, the idea is that we will put this into the gallery. There are animal mummies on display in the museum as you walk around the funerary gallery. Probably not the right place for animal mummies, but they're there anyway at the moment. But there's no information about the contents of just assumptions about the contents of the animal. So we can correct that and put that right in the future. And this is the kinds of animal mummies that we have in the museum, not just the traditional wrappings. You can see a cat mummy here, often not a cat inside, I have to say. This is, I don't know if the animation will work. It's really, the light doesn't help, but just strips away, digitally unwraps the wrappings and can show the juvenile crocodile inside. There's no scale, but that's about 50 centimeters. But we also have ceramic jars for animal mummy interment, animal interment, and also wooden containers as well. So there's a world of possibility that can be applied to the animal mummies in the collection. I was talking to an Egyptologist yesterday who has been to Saqqara in Egypt, with the incredible animal necropolis, and she was telling me that there are estimations of 5 to 8 million animal mummies that have been excavated to date from the deposits in Saqqara. Just vast numbers. So there's a lot that we can tell, I think, a lot that we can find out of new information about these collections. And this is our X-ray imaging suite, where that work on animal mummies is being undertaken. It's a kind of almost an industrial facility for X-ray. So you have the X-ray tube here and the detector here, turntable for doing CT work, just rotating the object on the turntable and doing volumetric reconstruction from the X-ray. This is Dan, and this is the Discobulus, and it's 700 kilograms of marble. And the Discobulus is on permanent display in the museum, but it goes on loan frequently. So it was brought into the lab just after it had returned from loan to India, where it had been on display for 6 months in an exhibition. And of course, when it returns to the museum, we need to condition check the object. And one of the ways to condition check the object is to take X-rays of it. And I mean, it's extensively reconstructed, this piece. I'm not going to show you the slides. I could. First of all, the head is not the original head. It's an alien head that points in the wrong direction. But there are cracks on the arm here. Much of the face has been reconstructed. There is an entirely new finger which has been, and much of that restoration was not known before this object was brought into the British Museum. Some restorations taken place. But what I wanted to make the point is that by having the facility, the in-house science facilities, is that you can deliver this work on site for the collection material. So it's a really important collection care role that we play. So on to temporary experiment. How am I doing, Robert? Have I got 15? Thank you. So the temporary experiment refers to the establishing of a laboratory at the museum, and that happened at the end of the First World War. Many of the objects were put into underground storage. They were placed in wooden crates in the underground station and tunnels around Holborn and Bloomsbury, but they were heated throughout the years of the First World War. This was to protect from potential bombing raids over London. So when a lot of the organic material emerged from these crates, there was mold growth, and a lot of metal objects, when they emerged from the crates, there was corrosion or accelerated corrosion. And at the time, there was no scientific expertise within the museum, or indeed in the wider world of cultural heritage, to be able to respond to this crisis. And so the trustees of the museum went to government, went to Treasury, in the same way that the trustees would do today, and asked for additional funding. And initially, they brought in somebody called Alexander Scott, who was a chemist, very distinguished chemist, had retired, actually. He was well into his 60s when he joined the British Museum. And he initially was called upon to write a report on the so-called problems of the British Museum. And he wrote that, and he concluded in his report that he felt that there should be a laboratory on site in order to deal with these kinds of issues. And that then happened. The trustees were successful. They persuaded government, and government released £100 per year for 3 years to support the laboratory. This guy, Harold Plinderleith, when he joined the museum in 1924, called it a miserable allocation. And he said the laboratory had no equipment, just pots and pans, and a fume cupboard that under no circumstances could be found to work. We've kind of all been there. I've been there much more recently than that, not having fume cupboards that work. But anyway, but it was an interesting time in terms of excavations around the world. There were major excavations in Mesopotamia at the time. And of course, the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922 meant that individuals like Howard Carter, Alfred Lucas, a distinguished forensic scientist who supported the recovery of objects from the tomb of Tutankhamun, were regular visitors to the museum in London. They brought samples. So the objects went to Cairo. The vast majority of the objects went to Cairo directly. And Lucas and others on site were charged with packaging up and transporting the objects safely. However, samples came back to London and were distributed around the network of scientists who were operating in the UK in the sort of immediate post-war period, distributed widely. Some of that work was published, some of it wasn't. It was a rather haphazard exercise. But Plinderleith was very much taken by some of the substances which emerged from Egypt, including the contents of this rather wonderful calcite jar, described as an ancient fatty substance which had not entirely decomposed in the process of time. And Plinderleith, not really an organic chemist, a good chemist, but he was really developing conservation treatments at the time, enlisted someone called Alfred Chaston Chapman, who was a microbiologist, a chemist, an expert on brewing. And they did really elegant chemistry. This is pre-instrumental analysis, so no chromatographs or mass spectrometers. This was all done through wet chemical means. I have to say they destroyed very large amounts of sample in delivering this work. But deliver it they did. They identified the substance as primarily an animal fat. They described it as a cosmetic. Whether it was a cosmetic or not, we don't know. With perhaps a small constituent of resin or balsam. And they published it. It was the first scientific publication of the new laboratory. It was published in 1926 in the Journal of the Chemical Society. And they presented it. So they went to, you won't be able to see that very well, but they went to the British Association for the Advancement of Science in Oxford in 1926 and presented the work. And this is the kind of equivalent of the social media response of the press articles, a digest of the press articles, because obviously Tutankhamun, this particular period, was incredibly popular. And so on that. So that work was reported and published. It was the first application. Scott himself was invited to Egypt to work with Carter and Lucas on the recovery of objects from the tomb. He's here on the right-hand side with his Crouch research microscope. There are examples of these research microscopes in the Science Museum today. It was really the only bit of kit that they had in the 1920s to do their research. He took an image there in the middle of a beetle that was recovered from the tomb, and a slide was made of the beetle. We've now taken digital images of these slides, and we'll make them available in due course. But when he got to Luxor, and many of the questions that Carter and Lucas were asking him were about microbiology. They were about fungal growth. They were about bacterial decay of the organic objects. There were brown spots all over the wall-painted walls of the tomb. The sarcophagus had extensive growth as well. And when he returned to London, he took samples. He enlisted the support of Elsie Wakefield, who was a mycologist at Kew, who really answered all his questions for him. It found it difficult to identify individual species, but could tell that that the fungal growth had long died, that it wasn't active. There was no fruiting bodies on the fungi. So it arrested the concerns of the archaeologists who were working on site. Okay, leaping forward a little bit now, let's move forward to the advent of radiocarbon dating. So radiocarbon dating, carbon-14 dating. Remarkably, the British Museum was an early pioneer of radiocarbon dating in the UK. Many of you will know that Nobel Prize winner, Manhattan Project alumnus Willard Libby was based at the University of Chicago and developed the method of radiocarbon dating in the 1940s, started suggesting the idea of radiocarbon dating through measuring, monitoring the decay of the radioactive isotope in 1946, and published the first carbon-14 dates from archaeological contexts in 1949, as you can see here with this famous age determination plot comparing historical age. Now, what did he use for his known historical age? He went to pieces of wood from Egyptian tombs that had the Egyptian chronology was relatively well established. And so the wood could be dated reasonably accurately, notwithstanding this is pre-calibration, of course, this is old wood effects and so on, but nevertheless could draw up a good calibration curve. So this was in 1949. And already by 1949, he was already in correspondence with Plenderleaf, who was still at the British Museum, still developing conservation treatments for the objects, still undertaking research into many of the objects in the collection. And this is a letter from Plenderleaf. He was addressed then as the keeper of conservation and scientific research. And Libby was incredibly generous in sharing the blueprints of his laboratory, of his laboratory facilities for measuring radiocarbon. And he shared all that with the British Museum and sent his blueprints to the museum. And Libby's letter, I don't know if you might not be able to read this, but it says, "Since I wrote to you, the chilling effects of austerity are once more in evidence." This is 1949, in the immediate post-Second World War process. And he said, as much of our lives depends on the decision of the trustees as to whether a decision would be taken to develop radiocarbon dating facilities at the British Museum. Well, as the story goes, yes, the trustees did agree, and they did agree to fund a laboratory. And this rather amazing black and white image shows the radiocarbon dating lab in the late 1950s, late 1960s. It was taken by somebody who still occasionally comes into the British Museum as one of our honorary members of staff. And he remembers fondly the vacuum equipment for isolating or combusting the object, piece of wood, for example, and collecting the carbon dioxide, which was then passed into this chamber, this incredible steel shroud, to try and minimize the effects of background radiation of cosmic rays and so on, in order to get a reasonably accurate date with a Geiger counter system within this steel unit. And the first dates of the British Museum were published 10 years later in 1959. And they went for their piece of wood of known date was St. Cuthbert's coffin from Durham Cathedral, which they were permitted to sample in order to transfer to the museum to be combusted. And the dates were published in the first date list of the British Museum. Okay, thank you. So on to the laboratory infrastructure today. This is the facilities. We no longer have radiocarbon dating. There's a long story about that one. We have a range of different analytical techniques and imaging technologies in order to apply to the collection around the care of the collection, its research and its dissemination. And just to show you some examples, this is not an animation, but some of the imaging techniques that we use. This is a so-called Mexican mosaic, which is a wooden object, a wooden carving with lots of mosaic tesserae pieces attached to the sculpture using resin, plant resin. And the tesserae are made of different kinds of stone and shell, coral, and so on. And so we can use X-ray CT to probe the interior structure of this to see how it was made up. We can do 3D scans of the surface. We can do multispectral imaging to look at the responses of those different surface materials under different wavelengths of light. And we can do digital microscopy to give high magnification images of these structures. And what we're trying to do, and I think one of the innovations at the museum at the moment is try and blend and bring together these different imaging technologies. And the team working on this have been working with NASA, who have a wonderful website for manipulating all of these multiple kinds of images, CT surface scanning of pieces of asteroid and so on that have fallen to Earth or been collected from the moon and so on. And they have this 3D interactive website. We want to do exactly the same with these wonderful Mexican mosaics. We also need people to work in the laboratory. So we have a range of chemists and biologists and physicists who work on the collection, applying the different technologies. Some are not portable, used in the laboratory. Others, such as portable XRF, which you have here in Bradford, used on excavations in Egypt. Of course, it's not possible to remove any archaeological material from Egypt today, but we collaborate with ongoing excavations in Egypt and can help to develop new approaches to archaeological excavation there. And one of the incredible spin-offs from over 100 years of having scientific laboratories at the museum is reference collections. And there is an incredible array of material samples. 5 minutes. Okay, thank you very much. Right, I better hurry up then. Including the wonderful radiocarbon dating store. But there is real opportunity. We need to make more of this available. And that's part of our aim through the research infrastructure funding from the AHRC, is to begin to digitize as much of this as possible, because external researchers need to be aware of the opportunities that are afforded by having such remarkable materials in the reference collections. Quick case study, then I'll do this in 2 or 3 minutes. Exhibition Burma to Myanmar was held from late 23 to early 24, so finished earlier on this year. And just to give you an idea of the sort of planning for exhibitions and the scientific research, this is an email I got in March 2021. I was sitting in my kitchen just a few miles away from here. And it was, I think, the 3rd national lockdown, if I remember correctly. And a curator, I'm not naming the curator, wrote to me saying, sorry to inundate you suddenly with emails. I left that bit in just to show you how busy I am, but I'm just starting to work on a grant in conjunction with the Burma to Myanmar exhibition in 2023. I'm interested in testing the textile collection, particularly the Karen material particular group from lower Myanmar, to see if we can figure out how dyes and fibers change through time. We tried to get a grant in the intervening period. We were rejected for the grant, but we thought we'd do the work anyway. It synergized with existing expertise we have in textiles and dyes. Here's examples of the textiles and garments that we looked at. And the analytical protocol is quite involved, but it involves quite a lot of non-invasive analysis first in order to establish whether any sampling is justified. And we don't take decisions about sampling. That must be taken by the heads of curatorial teams, who take decision before we go down this route and into any invasive analysis. And then we'll apply molecular-based techniques as well as sampling for Raman, FTIR, SEM, and so on. Digital microscope images showed some of the high detail of some of the fibers, these particularly vibrant colors. And we applied molecular analysis to identify the fibers, identify the dyes, a red natural dye, either from a plant or an insect source, almost certainly locally available dyestuffs. A blue dye, indigo, widely spread across many, many plants, but again, indicating, I think, a local use of the dyes. However, that didn't explain the rather bright color of green and orange here underlying. So this is a red dye. This is red here, but this is bright orange. This is a blue dye, and this is green. So clearly something was being mixed with the dyes. And we had to go back to look at the other techniques that were employed, particularly Raman spectroscopy here, and scanning electron microscopy with energy dispersive X-ray analysis detected a lot of lead and chromium on these fibers. I'm going to have to cut a long story short. The team working on this identified a synthetic colorant called chrome yellow, lead chromate, which was first used from about the 1820s onwards. And so chrome yellow was being used, right, okay, I've got to explain this in a very short space of time. The chrome yellow was developed as an industrial process in the 1820s in Western Europe. And cotton dyed with chrome yellow was then exported to other countries, including to Burma, Myanmar, where it was used and incorporated by the people's weaving and the textile makers. And what they did was adjust the color. So they then re-dyed the yellow dyed cotton with the red dye to create the orange, and they re-dyed the yellow dyed cotton with the blue dye to make the greens. So the really interesting biography of these textiles, of Western industrialization, of synthetic dye, colorants, I should say. This isn't actually a dye, it's not molecular based, being rolled out across the globe, and then other users adjusting, manipulating those colors. Work was published, and we exhibited that work in the Burma to Myanmar exhibition. Okay, I'm going to have to skip this bit, but Diego has been working very closely with the Society of Dyers and Colorists. Where are they based? They're based in Bradford, of course, just up the road in Perkin House. And Diego's been building reference collections of synthetic dyes and now has a project looking at the evolution and the introduction of synthetic dyes in many different parts of the globe, and how individual communities, textile weavers and dyers and so on, responded to that changing practice. Okay, I'm on to AI. Have I got a couple of minutes just to try and spark some discussion around AI? So the rapid pace of AI is daunting for many of us. Last week, the Nobel Prize for Chemistry was announced to biochemists and to computational scientists. One biochemist based in Washington, two computational scientists from Google DeepMind in London, based in London. Nobel Prize. An AI program for predicting the complex three-dimensional structures of proteins. The benefits to science, as many have hailed, are manifold in terms of health, benefits, fundamental science, and so on. It's called AlphaFold. But it's probably safe to say that AlphaFold is not yet a panacea that replaces everything that has gone before. Indeed, some of the known limitations of AlphaFold at present are strengths of other investigative approaches, albeit slow, that have been applied for many, many years. So like many other technological developments, AlphaFold will operate alongside complementary approaches rather than replacing them, at least for now. A recent report published by the Royal Society makes four main recommendations around the role of AI within scientific research: improving access to AI infrastructures, prioritizing the usability of AI tools, a plea to follow open science principles, publish the data, the algorithms that are being applied, and to ensure the ethical use for the public good. Now, AI within cultural heritage is not new, but there are issues to overcome. For example, do museums have the infrastructure and data they need to benefit from AI? You may have seen the major report into technology in the health service that was published a few weeks ago, and that was signaling some challenges around AI infrastructure, even within the health service. Data are often in silos, hospital by hospital, and the museum sector is exactly the same. So we're not yet ready to join up all our data sets to be able to explore the full benefits of AI for museum collections. And AI is also evolving extremely rapidly, almost certainly faster than museum resources can respond to. There will be huge benefits for the museums sector, particularly in the digitization of museum collections. But I thought I'd just end on, to end with Sloane again, in that if you know the trajectory of Sloane's collection is that it was largely distributed from the end of the 19th century right up until the 1970s. And the quote from Delbourgo's book says that researchers must go to the British Library at St Pancras to read Sloane's manuscripts, to the British Museum on Great Russell Street to examine his objects, and to the Natural History Museum in South Kensington to study his plants. This is an obstacle for many, many museum collections. Sloane's collection, but many others too, have been separated, and there are major obstacles to bringing these collections together. And the aim of the Sloane Lab project, funded by the AHRC, is one of the 5 discovery programs called Towards a National Collection, is looking at how you can bring these digital collections together so that you can apply AI tools and other open data tools to bring this network of data, of objects, of Sloane's manuscripts into one single digital platform. So there are opportunities and there are directions of travel. We're a long way from realizing those. Just finally, as the museum moves into a phase of redisplay, we want to take some of the ideas that we've taken from temporary exhibitions, such as Arctic climate and culture, disposable rubbish, and us to think about sustainability, to think about climate change and the impacts on that. At the moment, you could walk around the British Museum and not read much about that in the permanent galleries. And also, scientists have been curating exhibitions. The Women Silversmiths from Amman was curated entirely by scientific research staff looking at the technology, women technology of production of these intricate pieces of silver used in ceremonial activities in Amman today. And then finally, the research infrastructure for conservation and heritage science allows museums and universities to bring their facilities and make them accessible to more groups and individuals than have previously been possible in the past, with major funding to develop a new national infrastructure. And we have two positions which we're filling in the British Museum at the moment. One, for the project scientists to look at those reference collections that I showed earlier and begin to think about how they can be digitized and made available. And the other one will work in the CT scanning suite to develop CT scanning for other museum collections where objects can come in to the British Museum and be investigated there. Rob, I've finished. Thank you for your patience. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Carl. That's great. Really fascinating. We've got about 20 minutes now for some questions and discussions. So I'm very happy. Anybody like to kick off? Who's going to start? Be brave. Vince.
You started and finished off with collecting the world, but I think it was Foucault said the fundamental event of the modern age was the capture of the world as an image. Now, even setting aside AI, are we entering a period when we are appropriating images, owning them in a different way? Can you cope with them? The implications of blockchains and ownership? Are we just entering a different age of appropriation? And how are you going to deal with that?
That's a great question, Vince. I mean, we can't even store our images for what I was absolutely astounded by the capability you have here for data storage. It's a really interesting question. So we have the sort of FAIR principles with data, which is all about open access of making everything available and sharing it. But then you have the care principles, which have been developed by indigenous groups, which are very worried about authority and control and having a continuation of some of the power imbalances that have existed for hundreds of years. So there's real tensions there about what you make available, how you make it available, what's harvested. The ethical dimensions of AI are manifold, but they're not new to science, of course, but they are challenging given the scales that we're now working on and potentially can work on in science. So, I mean, I don't have answers for you. You probably have got more to say on that than I have, but it's a significant tension.
The thing is, Eugene Ching, I think you know, came up with this concept of the first original copy. And how were we? This was going to be one of the big challenges to heritage, as to how you cascaded those original copies from one area to another, and who could potentially own them globally. So it's a big one.
It's a big one.
Excellent. Anybody got another big or small question? Lynn.
Cheers. So you obviously like Bradford a bit, and presumably you know the museums that we have in Bradford. Now, as far as I know, none of the museums have. Do they have any research facilities? It's an embarrassment. I'm not asking you that. But in terms of your work and the British Museum's work, at what level of local museum do you think the British Museum have a valid and useful input? Or can you get so small that it's just shrug your shoulders?
It's a real two-way relationship and existence. It's incredibly important. I mean, the collections in some of the regional museums in Bradford and Halifax are absolutely astonishing. I mentioned the Bankfield, I think, did I, in my talk? I mean, I didn't mention, I did. Okay, I've got slides, but yeah. The Bankfield Museum has an incredible collection of South Asian textiles. So if our colleagues in my department are going to do that kind of program of looking at the rollout of synthetic dyes across the globe, then we would want to work with collections such as the Bankfield. So the collections here are remarkable. I mean, it has to be, there are incredible pressures in the museum sector, incredible pressures. I mean, Museums Association, real terms, cuts of 20–30% over the last few years. That's hard to sustain. The staffing required to look after collections, people do what they can and people work incredibly hard, but there is a lot of pressure in the system. I know universities are under a lot of pressure currently. I think many sectors are, but I think there are opportunities and we want to work very closely. And I think, as I said, it's very much a two-way process.
We've got a couple of colleagues here from Bradford Museums. I don't know if you want to make a contribution, want to say something. Exactly.
I'm Jo Clinton-Tulloch. I'm the director of the National Science and Media Museum, part of the Science Museum Group. So in answer to your question, yes, we do carry out. We're fortunate enough, a bit like you, to be part of a national cohort of museums. And albeit maybe not in Bradford necessarily, our sister museums absolutely have quite extensive laboratories, a bit like yours, probably not quite as extensive as yours, I would imagine. But yes, I would argue all museums carry out research to a greater or lesser extent. So you just said it's very much about resource and opportunity. Partnership absolutely is the only way we're going to make the most of the resources that we've got. And we certainly constantly look for opportunities. And indeed, I know we've got colleagues here from Bradford Museums and Galleries, and we at the moment have live projects which are about connecting our collections, and through those connections and through that shared research and understanding, making them more widely available and accessible to more people. So the work's ongoing, but it's a mountain to climb. Can I just add one other thing as well, which is a bit to your AI question as well, and to the point you were making about the opportunities there. One of the biggest challenges we've got is that probably only about 50% of our entire collections, I'm speaking for the Science Museum Group, are currently digitised. And you can only use these collections using AI and other digital resources if you've got the basic information in a digital format with the metadata associated with it. If you don't get to that first space, all of the other opportunities currently aren't available to you. So there's a big need, I would argue, for all museums to do that first stage before we can all join in and make the most of the opportunities that AI and others offer us.
There's a really important point there in terms of the sort of undervaluing of some of the sort of what one might call the documentation work and digitization work. But if we're going to realize the benefits of these tools, we really have to complete those programs, and we're trying to do that at the British Museum in relation to certain events that happened last year. But it's a huge issue. We have 2.5 million object records representing about 5 million objects online. So you could Google and go onto collection online at the British Museum, and all of the objects I show you will get a lot of information about the chief mourner's costume and the Lewis chess pieces. It shows where they've been on loan, what conservation treatments and scientific research has been undertaken, and so on. And that's incredibly valuable, but it's not complete. And so there's a huge amount of work to be done to do that. And if we can draw in some of these tools, I mean, it's not easy. We do work with Google and so on. It's not the easiest thing to do with very different kinds of relationships, different kinds of trajectories as organisations. But let's hope those things can work out and happen on a wider platform in the future.
Don't know if James or Lizzie want to add anything from the Bradford Museums and Galleries perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. And firstly, you need to put a white spot on your map to say you've loaned objects to Bradford.
Yeah.
I'm very excited about the partnership coming up. So I'm James Stewart, head of Bradford Museums and Galleries. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about the how the use and aligning the use of AI with the kind of public purpose of museums and how that works. I mean, museums, as you know, have gone through a bit of an existential crisis, certainly the local authority sector where I am. And I think we talk a lot about the use of technology. I sense there's still a little bit of a there was recently a conference at the National European Museums thing called use of AI, integrity and innovation. But the question of integrity and the use of AI seemed to be something that was raised in a kind of sort of defensive sense that, you know, is this going to take over the kind of role of the museum? Because as we know, we've moved away from museums being the oracles of knowledge. People come with smartphones and the place have more information than we could ever put on the walls of museums. So we've lost that role, thankfully. And the whole idea of how we engage with our visitors and that whole kind of thing about sentiment reading as well, the use of AI to judge how people are feeling in museums, I think is a very interesting way, because we make a lot of assumptions about the way people react and how they feel about museums and how they feel when they're engaged in the museum. But I think the use of AI could really help us understand what makes a difference between engaging with real artifacts and real heritage.
Yeah, so a lot in that. I'm sure the Science Museum is thinking about the role of AI in modern society and the ways in which people react. In the context of museums, that point in the Royal Society report about the kind of ethical dimension, I think part of that is about feedback loops and how you can think about evaluating some of the outcomes of AI and getting the public involved in that process, because there's a huge issue of trust in not just AI, but kind of science more broadly. And thinking about ways in which you can engage the public with outputs from AI, I think is a good way of thinking through engaging more people, getting people to think critically about some of these particular implications. I'm not singling out AI, that could be for any aspect of science. So I think that I mentioned just the Sloan collection as one sort of area of bringing digital collections together, but there's the whole visitor experience around AI. I mean, chatbots, some museums are thinking about, you know, developing ways in which you can interact with objects through devices such as a chatbot. We're not there yet, but in a few years' time, we easily could be there. So there are huge implications, I think, for the way in which museums operate. I hope it just doesn't replace the kind of people and the resources that are required to do the basic work and the engagement.
And so do all of our efforts. So, Brian.
Hi, thanks very much, Carl, for a very stimulating lecture. So I wanted to also ask a bit of a big picture question about I mean, your job, as I understand it, is to use scientific techniques, or at least the science lab at the British Museum, to explore and understand better issues around the artifacts you've got, either what they're made of, or some of the implications behind where they came from, and the societies that produced them, or the ways they were produced. And I think about this. I'm a trustee of the Science Museum Group, it's already been mentioned, and the thing that I fret about quite a lot with museums generally is that in order to research the activity, the stuff that's in museums, and I do believe museums are about stuff, and I don't think, by the way, AI will replace everything. I think, you know, I feel the same about books, by the way, in libraries. Nothing will replace the book. The digital experience won't replace it, and I think nothing will, in the end, replace the object, although it'll be an important add-on. So if we're going to keep looking into stuff, we're going to keep using scientific techniques, but the cost of scientific techniques and the range of them is going up and up and up and up, and the numbers of different kinds of techniques you can bring to bear. So I'm just wondering how you think about the future. Maybe it's your job to do it. Maybe somebody at the British Museum is thinking, in 10 years' time, how are you going to select which? You're not going to be able to do all of the use all of the scientific techniques, because you can't possibly have them. And you're not going to be able to study all of the things that could be studied, because the number of things that could be studied is enormous. So there's an immense kind of prioritization problem
which I don't know how you go about it. And it seems to me that's an issue for all museums. As far as the research side of what they're doing is, I just wondered if you had any comments.
I say, thank you, Brian, for that question. I mean, there are incredible technical developments in that what used to be done using entirely separate techniques, entirely separate workflows are coming together so much more. So you've got workflows that single technique, single method of preparation, maximum input, much greater amounts of information than those techniques were able to produce in the past. So technical developments, I think, are really important to think about in terms of that kind of approach. Yeah, somebody else come in with that. Yes.
Lily, do you want to?
So my question is completely different. It's around the ethics of
Let's comment on Brian. We might have to have a glass of wine over that. Sorry. Yeah.
So there's been some discussion around the ethics of scanning mummified remains and whether that could be seen as intrusive, as unwrapping the mummies themselves. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, an interest. I have read about that. There is incredible appetite and interest around this. I mean, I didn't show this quite a lot of work that the museum has done on scanning human remains as well. I didn't show any of that this afternoon. It's kind of a different group within the museum, being used in exhibitions and so on. Actually, it's a major international touring exhibition, so it hasn't been seen much in this country. And wherever it goes, it's been to 6 or 7 different countries. The responses, you know, it's all the warnings about display of human remains, about the ethical dimensions. Here we have policies on the ethical treatment of human remains. You know, we're governed by the Human Tissue Act where that's appropriate within the last 1,000 years. So a lot of what you do here in terms of Bradford with curating the human remains here, you know, museums do that as well. But wherever we are displaying them, if we're providing the information about, you know, those individuals, the research and the reasons why we're doing the research, we haven't had a backlash. So this, I don't know if any of you managed to get to the Stonehenge exhibition a couple of years ago in London. There was a lot of human remains, including young children who were displayed in that exhibition. You get one complaint from 200,000 visitors. So it's really interesting. Now, some people may have decided not to go into the exhibition because of the display of human remains, but it didn't appear to be a kind of significant issue. So I know that some people have those concerns, and I think it's something that we do need to be cognizant of, but there isn't a huge amount of evidence yet that really pushes us towards taking any action other than what we're currently doing. What do you think? I mean, you're.
I think some of it is around association, and that we as society have brought to view, particularly non-fashion remains, in completely different ways. So they become almost numb to it. But I think certainly young generations are growing up and becoming much more aware of the issue. And it's whether the work that we're doing in museums is to continue to be appropriate in research, or whether the knowledge and understanding that we're gaining.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, there is similar, you mentioned the kind of CT scanning, but there are questions, certain countries around displaying human remains, and some museums have taken human remains off display, not so much in this country, but in North America, there's been some high profile examples. So it's something that could grow in the future. And I think museums need to be really strong on reminding about, you know, how the museums care for the collections and why we do what we do and what we can learn from what we do, I think. And I hope that will make a strong contribution to retaining that environment.
Thank you. That's time for.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I do have a question which I think is related to the one that Brian asked. At the beginning, you showed us the quotation, sorry, I've forgotten the name of the person, but something along the lines of research shouldn't be measured just through grants raised or publications or what have you. It rather should be measured through the impact, the inspiration that it has on people's lives and the way it can affect what happens in the world. You also said that that the person who had made that comment hadn't said anything about how that would be measured, which gave me the sense that maybe you had some thoughts on how it should be measured, which might go to some extent to the point about prioritization. I'm just interested in your perspective on outcomes and how you assess what's happening.
Yeah. So at the moment, I actually think museums, let me say the British Museum, I hear a lot, and remember that I haven't been in the museum sector for that long, but I hear a lot from museum colleagues in London who tell me that, you know, we do impact in a kind of almost like a retort to the way in which impact is developed within the university sector. And I actually think there are some flaws in the way the British Museum looks at the impact of the exhibition numbers of people. So, you know, you will hear often that 6 million people visit the British Museum every year. So it's recovered from the pandemic plummet, but it's now back up to 6 million. We do very little to actually ask those 6 million people whether they've been inspired, whether they've not been inspired, whether they're disgusted, whether they're angry, or whether they're, you know, comfortable with what they've seen. And I think that's something we need to work on. So exhibitions, the temporary exhibitions, so the Hugh Locke exhibition, people are being invited to make comments on that exhibition and to feedback, and that does get processed. We have visitor interpretation teams and so on. But I think we could work a little bit harder in terms of how we measure impact in the way that, you know, under strict rep terms, you know, you've got to be able to evidence what's changed. And, you know, we've all been there. I've been there many times myself in terms of, you know, scanning for that evidence and trying to use that evidence. I'm not saying that the museum sector should move towards RAF style models, but I think we do need to be quite robust in the way that we do think about impact and not simply through footfall. I think there are many other ways that we can think about. And, you know, what I said to you around AI and how you might introduce sort of feedback loops to help evaluate some of the outcomes from AI using people who come into museum spaces, I think could be one way of doing that. So I think there are opportunities. I'm still thinking about Brian's question.
I think, I mean, we could spin off into a whole interesting discussion around how we're thinking about measuring impact for the 2025 activities and so on, but we've run out of time. So we'll have to leave that for informal discussions afterwards. I want to say thank you particularly to Anna for organising. To Brian for sponsoring the event and thinking of the ideas for the event. Thank you very much. And finally, most of all, to Carl for a really fascinating evening. Thank you very much.